Hello, my name is Ileana and I am going to be going over the appendicular skeleton. First off, we're going to start with the pectoral girdle, which is the clavicle, this bone going right here. In that we have the acromial end, which is this region here, the point of the shoulder, and then we have the the sternal end right here next to the sternum. We move on to the scapula, which is this area back here. Um, in the scapula, we have the subscapular fossa, which is this region here. Right along, we have the glenoid cavity, and you can see this little bone kind of sticking out right here. We then have back here, we have the spine going across here, and then we have the acromion, as mentioned earlier, point to the shoulder. We then move on to the subcutaneous fossa, which is right above the spine, this region here. And then we have the infraspinatus fossa, which is right below the spine. And lastly, we have the acromioclavicular joint, which is this joint right here. We are now going to talk about the arm, which is this region here. In the arm, we have it's also known as the humerus. And in the humerus, we have the head, which is this region right here. We then have the greater tubercle, which is the opposite end, this pointy part right here. We then have the lesser tubercle, which is right below the head in this region. Next, we have the deltoid tuberosity, which is this middle region right here. We next move on to the back, where we have the medial epicondyle, which is this lower bone right here. We then have the lateral epicondyle, which is the opposite, this end right here. We then move on to the coronoid fossa. And what goes on in here is it allows the ulna to move freely. So the coronoid fossa in the front is this little dip right here. We then have the capitulum, which is the bone right here, and it articulates with the ulna and the radius, which are below down here. We then have the trochlea, which is right behind here, and it's this little dip right here. And this articulates as well with the ulna and the radius. We then have the olecranon, which is a point of the shoulder, which is this point right here, the olecranon fossa. Which is this little dip here next to the trochlea, which is this looks like a little bar that goes across. Can't see it there. And in the olecranon fossa, it allows the ulna to move freely as well. So now we're going to talk about the forearm, which is this region here. And in the forearm, we have the ulna, which is this longer looking bone. And in the ulna, we have the olecranon, which is this region here, pointy area, which is the elbow. We then have the coronoid process, which is, there's a better view in the front of the skeleton, which is this region right here. And then we have the styloid process, which is the pointy end of the ulna, which is down at the bottom here. And you're able to see it more on the posterior side. And it's this pointy area right here. We then have the radius, which is this smaller bone. And in the radius, we have the head, which is this top region here. We then have the radial tuberosity, which is the smaller pointy bone. Or sorry, it's this little pointy bone right here that sticks out at the top of the radius. And down at the bottom we have the styloid process, which is the pointy bone on the radius down here. We are now going to go over the carpus, which is this region here. And in the carpus, we have the proximal row, which is lateral to medial. We have here the scaphoid. We then have the lunate. Next, we have the triquetral. And lastly, we have the pisiform next door right here. We then move on to the distal row, lateral to medial. We have the trapezium, which is right here. We then move on to the trapezoid, which is right next to it. And then we have the capitate, next area here. And lastly, we have the hamate next door. So the bones that form the wrist joint with what forearm bone is the radius, which is this bone here. Next, which bones forms a joint with the hallux, which is the thumb, and that is the phalanges, which we're going to talk about next. So now I'm going to point out to the metacarpals, which are these longer bones here. And then we have the phalanges, which are the tips of the fingers, the digits right below here. So it's these regions here. So we are now going to go over the pelvic girdle, which is the coxal bones, which create the hip. And the point, so I'm going to point out the three bones that fuse during development of the skeleton to form the coxal bone, which is the first one is the ilium, this region here. We then have the ischium, which is this bone down here, and the pubis, which is this bone across here. We then move on to the acetabulum, which is this pointy bone right. See if I can get it here. It's right below the pubis. So right in here. In this region here. We then have the pubic symphysis, which is this middle line right here. Then we move on to the obturator foramen, which are these two hollow bones here. We then have the iliac crest, which is this top region right here. Next we have the anterior superior iliac spine, which is this region right here. We then have the iliac fossa, and that's this little part here. And then we have the greater sciatic notch, which I'm going to turn the skeleton to show that. And that is right in here. We then have the ischial spine, which is this little bone right here. And lastly, we have the ischial tuberosity, which is, if I could show it, right below here. So now we're going to talk about the femur, which is this bone here. And first off, we have the head, which is this notch in here. We then have the greater trochanter, which is right above here. Next, we have the lesser trochanter, which is right below here. This little bone right here. Next, we have the abductor tubercle, which is this bone top right here. And this side will be over here. We then have the medial epicondyle, which is right below it, this region right here. Next, we have the lateral epicondyle, which would be on the opposite side, right over here. And the medial and lateral condyles, which there's a better view on the back. So here we have the medial and the lateral condyles. And lastly, we have the patella, which is the knee. Better seen here on the anterior side, and this triangular little bone right here. Next we have the tibia, which is this longer bone. And in the tibia we have the medial and lateral condyles. Next we have the tibia tuberosity, which is this shadow looking area right here. We then have the medial malleolus, which is this little pointy bone right here. And lastly, we have the proximal and distal tibiofibular joints, which are right between the tibia and the fibula, right here, which is the proximal next to the patella, and the distal is right in between here, next to the ankle bone. So we then have the fibula, which is this outer bone here. And right up here we have the head. And right below here we have the lateral malleolus, right down here. So we are now going to go over the tarsus, which is this region here. And first off we have the talus, which is right above here. And this bone articulates with the tibia, fibula, and the strong calcaneus. We then have the calcaneus, which is the heel, right behind here, this bone right here. We then have the navicular, which is right around here. We then have the cuboid, which is right over here. Next we have the medial, which is right over here. Next to it we have the intermediate and the lateral cuneiform bones. We then have the metatarsus, which are these longer bones right here. And right down here we have the phalanges, which are the digits, also known as the toes, in this area here. And now we end with the hallux, which is the big toe. And that's this one right here. Thank you.